We always say seat time is king, so sit on down and listen in to Motorsports Tech Talk with your hosts, Brian and Eric. Eric, how's it going?
I'm doing pretty good, man. Uh, Next week is the Roar. The race season's starting back up, so not much to complain about.
Yeah, you'll be heading out. Which team will you be working with out there?
So it's still it'll be Volt Racing, but with that Archangel Motorsports umbrella.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always good to start up the next season. I mean, yeah, it's relatively short break between last and now, but yeah.
Right. I mean, generally the break isn't that long, but last year that schedule was extended, right? And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, barely had any off time.
Yeah, but I mean, as motorsports fans, it's always good to now we can jump right back into it. I think we plan to, based on what you see there and what the results are, we'll probably go through kind of a preview of the Daytona 24. Talk about who we think's looking good, who's looking bad, who's got it in the bag already, who's sandbagging.
Yep. Sounds like a plan.
But today, though, today we would like to do kind of a part two on our intro to aero series. So in the first one, we talked about kind of basics of front splitters and rear wings, and then some also basic kind of aerodynamic theory. So if you missed that, I would recommend listening to that one first, and then jump into this one here. So today we're looking to talk about kind of going a little more in depth in splitter and kind of front aero design. Talk a little bit about kind of underbody aero, just basics there, as well as kind of flat bottoms and rear diffusers, and just kind of talk about what if you want to kind of step up your aero game, what you should kind of look for first, and kind of easy ways to try to get that underbody working for you without doing something that either doesn't work or just spending too much time and money on something that doesn't work. So yeah, I mean, I think we can start kind of expanding upon splitter design. We mostly just kind of talked about your standard flat splitter that just extends from the front of the car. We talked about kind of how the distance from the splitter to the ground can affect things. So now that you have your splitter in your car and you want to try to get some more out of it, kind of one of the first areas you can look is having some basically splitter diffusers at the bottom. So the idea of those being that it creates it kind of further helps accelerate the air through the bottom of that splitter by creating a low pressure at the outlet of that diffuser. And yeah, it works the same way as we'll talk later about a rear diffuser, but the intention is to kind of help that bottom of the splitter, which is similar to the rear wings, is their kind of working surface of that splitter. So it helps really improve the efficiency.
Yeah, and I mean that whole concept, I mean, we can get into it later, sort of as you mentioned, but it's all pretty much a nozzle, right? If you had cut a nozzle in half and used the ground as that midplane, that's what we're looking at. That flow has its tightest point or lowest pressure right in front of where that nozzle tightens up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
So yeah,
So
if you cut a nozzle in half, and I don't mean now, I don't mean down the tube for how you generally approach it, but I mean in half, like at the neck. It'll still work, right?
hmm
Just much less so. And that
yeah.
effectively is what having a flat bottom and a diffuser on your car is. But we can get even
Yes.
more out of it with what you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, like talking about, we talked about Bernoulli's principles last time, and it's just that similar effect when you start with a small area and expand to a large area. Pressure has to decrease in order to fill that area. So by creating that low pressure, it creates an area for the air to want to escape to, basically. So I guess when we call, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, when we say a kind of diffuser, we're talking about a kind of like Eric was saying, expanding kind of nozzle feature. So we're starting with from kind of a side view, or like a section of it just looks like a triangle. So it's starting low to the ground and then increasing an area up towards towards the I guess away from the ground. So
Mm-hmm.
so as far as splitter diffusers, most commonly they're found kind of in the area between the front tire and the, I guess, the kind of lower portion of the chassis or the subframe. So it's kind of one of the areas where you can try to get that flow into, but you have to be careful with it kind of interacting with the tire too much. So, and then there's also the I guess the question of what angle to run that diffuser at. So this is somewhere where maybe you can do, in your specific case, a little like put some wool tufts on it and try to see separation and things like that. But as far as kind of practical areas to start, similar to rear diffuser, I guess there's some papers you can find online that they do some kind of bluff body testing. So it's just kind of think of like almost like a derby, like a slot car, derby car, or something really simply shaped, and then they add a diffuser kind of element to it, and then they test different angles to see the kind of the optimal performance. And some of these papers will say usually somewhere in the range of 11 to 13 degrees is kind of the maximum you're going to see before separation. So that could be an area to start. Maybe start at like 10 degrees or so, and maybe work up from there. It also depends on, and that's just a simple diffuser, that it's just kind of it's only expanding upward, because you can also make it so that it expands kind
Outward.
of in the outward direction. So not just in the Z, but also in the Y.
But then you have a rate of change limit for that volume, right?
Yeah.
So it's not 11 degrees anymore if you're also expanding out.
Yes.
You have or not 11 degrees upwards, right? You're gonna have to trim that back a little bit.
Yeah.
And this is where using vanes, at least in the rear of the diffuser, comes into play, right? You're capturing those volumes, so they individually expand at a lower rate.
Yes. Yeah. So we can talk about that a little more with the rear diffusers. But yeah, you can add vanes, and like you said, it kind of separates it out. It can help keep it attached, which is always a good thing. So that's another area you can kind of mess with. But most of the basic designs I see kind of just do a non-vane setup. So that's where you could start. And it's really what I find when looking at cars with this setup, and we also added some diffusers onto our old Lemons Volvo. I find that in a lot of these cars, it's very much a packaging concern, because there's usually a lot of stuff in that area. There could be power steering coolers. There could be, I mean, if it's still a street car, you can have like the charcoal canister and all that kind of stuff in there. So, and then also you're avoiding, on one side you probably have the engine that's basically in the subframe that's blocking you, and then the other side you have the tire. So you just have to look at what space you have and try to optimize the size of it to fit in that space. So that's where you could kind of mess with the expanding in both the Z upward direction and the Y side to side direction, in order to kind of maximize that expansion if you have tight space constraints. So, and then of course the earlier you start that diffuser, the more expansion you can potentially get before it separates. So that can help as well. And I guess you'll also find, and we'll talk about this with diffusers, that the center, I guess the peak low pressure point, or I guess the center of pressure of the diffuser, or kind of I guess where you get your peak negative pressure will be at the initial portion of that diffuser, because that's where the air is moving the fastest, basically. So the more, I guess, the further forward you move that inlet of the diffuser, the further forward the center of pressure of that, I guess, part of the diffuser in this case, because it's only going to be kind of a small, or part of the splitter. It's only going to be a small part of it. So that's kind of one thing to look out for. But one thing I haven't really experimented too much with is kind of if you can push that entry of that splitter diffuser too far, if you start to have kind of further separation issues as the air is entering into the bottom of that splitter. So as long as you don't push it too close, it should be okay. But yeah, we've seen pretty good increases in kind of the front downforce from adding a diffuser. So that's kind of your next area to look at when you're designing your splitter.
And just to be clear, when you say adding diffuser, you mean specifically they're on the splitter?
Yes.
We're not talking about further back, anywhere else on the underbody yet. So
yes, yeah,
or the rear diffuser.
So specific to the splitter right now. From here, I guess another area where you can find a little more performance is, and it's pretty common to see on all different sorts of race cars, is adding dive planes. So dive planes, they
look sweet.
They do look sweet. Very often they're mostly, from what I've seen, they're mostly used as tuning tools for when, say, race cars have different downforce packages. So one thing you'll notice for, like, say, LMP1 cars, and I think even potentially some of the GT Le Mans cars, when they go from their kind of Le Mans the low downforce setup to their higher downforce, all the other racetrack setups, a lot of times they'll add or remove those dive planes. So a lot of times that's allowing them to balance out the aero between, because they're going to run maybe a more aggressive rear gurney flap on the rear wing, or a different angle, more aggressive angle of attack. So in order to balance the car out, they'll add these dive planes on, since maybe there's not really much room for them to modify the floor or this front splitter or anything from the low downforce spec. So
in my understanding, what I had been told previously was that these are not particularly efficient. Like, they add a lot of drag. Does that sort of fall in line with what you know about them?
Yeah, because I mean, you're going to create kind of a vortex off the ends of them, which add some induce some drag, similar to adding end plates on a wing. I think I guess the more they help with downforce in two ways. One, I mean, just their shape, it's kind of similar to, they could be similar to kind of a wing profile. They're usually, flat pieces of material, so it's not really highly optimized, but mainly it's creating a kind of high pressure above, low pressure below, just as a basic, aero device. But I guess one thing to note is when a lot of times you'll see them stacked. When you stack a few of them, any low pressure underneath will then be affected by the high pressure of the element below it. So like you kind of start getting diminishing returns as you add more elements. You can't just say add 2 giant front splitters to your car and expect them to double the front downforce, because that first, the splitter above the other one, basically there's going to be high pressure above the first splitter. It's going to reduce the effect of the low pressure below the other. So in this case, like adding a ton of dive planes might be kind of diminishing returns and adding a lot more drag. So maybe if you can make one large one, you can potentially get more benefit. But the other effect that a lot of these things have, or that dive planes have, is creating that vortex, and you can use that in several different ways. Now, this is an area where I'm not as familiar, so my understanding is you can potentially try to use it to interact with the tire wake coming off the front and push it in a direction that you want to, or potentially you can also have it interact in some ways with the side of the car, which then later kind of interacts with the rear wing potentially. So I think there's kind of a lot more to dive plane design than just buying something and putting it somewhere on the bumper.
But I do, for what it's worth, when I was looking at the real race cars, the dive planes on the Ford GT were water jet, just pieces of aluminum. Yeah, so the shape of the dive plane was curved, right? But where it protruded from the car, that was still two-dimensional. And then they just had tabs bent off of that, where it was riveted to the car. So
yeah,
you in your garage can make a GTLM quality dive plane, apparently. So
yeah. So don't go out there and buy those like really expensive carbon fiber ones. Yeah, I would experiment, with some just simple bent, maybe aluminum or maybe even really thin steel. And experiment with that, see if it seems like it's affecting the balance of the car. But I think that should be, if your rule set allows you to build relatively large splitters, I think you'll see more of a benefit from that before you need to start adding things like dive planes. And then I guess one other area of the front downforce that some people like to mess with is kind of adding almost end plates to the splitter. Now this area, this can be a little tricky. It's kind of because a lot of times you'll see on both kind of F1 front wings, the front splitters on like LMP1 cars, you'll see these kind of little foot plates that they add that have these, they're kind of like vortex channels. So basically they're trying to control the vortex off the front of that splitter, and similar to what I was saying with the dive planes, they're trying to affect the tire wake, as well as potentially seal kind of the side of the car a little bit with it. So no, that's an area where if you're not doing CFD and wind tunnel correlation and all this stuff, it's going to be very hard to just copy that for your car. So I think that's someplace maybe you should not focus on it, at least at an amateur kind of grassroots level. It's something that I don't think you'll see much benefits. At best, you might see a small benefit in downforce. But at worst, you're probably just adding a bunch of extra drag that you don't need in your lower power, potentially champ car or WRL car or something. So I think keeping it simple, sticking to kind of your splitter with some diffusers in it, as well as maybe some dive planes if you feel like you need a little extra in the front. But otherwise, I think you should be good with just the splitter with some diffusers in it. I think that should get you most of what you need. And you just tune by tuning those diffusers, trying to make them a little larger, and as well as just the size of your splitter. So that should get you plenty of front downforce to balance out any sort of rear wing you can find, for the most part, as long as you're not going to some crazy triple element wing. So but from there,
You're just
I guess
moving back to like a flat bottom.
yeah. So I guess you did your splitter, you now optimized it with some diffusers and maybe you added some dive planes if you need to. You have your rear wing, and it's set up with some nice swan neck mounts, and you have some nicely designed end plates and everything. So from here, I guess one area that it can be very, very big gains because you're starting to use more of the car basically as an air service, but is looking at the underbody. But this can also be, I feel, the hardest to get right in several different ways. Kind of the first way is to make a structure that's kind of smooth enough that will keep the flow basically attached underneath the car. A lot of times it can if you're making a bunch of different sheets that you're riveting together, you can create a lot of kind of bumpy spots, a lot of bolts sticking out, a lot of like seams that aren't like nice and close to each other. That's going to really reduce the efficiency of a flat bottom. And then I think the thing to look out for, though, the biggest thing to look out for with a flat bottom is underbody cooling, basically. So when you close off your, especially if you're fully closing off your exhaust and a lot of other parts. So now, basically, if you keep your exhaust under the car, you're going to have a lot of issues with basically heat damage from that exhaust. Usually the cars are designed to have that airflow under the car that helps cool both the exhaust itself as well as all the parts around it. So you're going to start melting things really quick if you enclose your exhaust underneath a flat bottom. So one of the easiest ways to kind of fix this is to run it out the side. So you'll try to get it basically around where the front wheels are, try to get it to sneak out kind of the front wheel well, and then have it come down the side. Alternatively, you can potentially maybe run it kind of through the actual kind of interior of the car. Obviously, you're going to want it sealed off and heat shielded nicely. But then the other option is to just leave the area around the exhaust open. But of course, that's going to greatly reduce kind of your efficiency there.
Or you can get a mid or rear engine car.
Yes, yeah.
Just go buy a Porsche. You're good to
can
go.
Also help. Exactly. So yeah, I mean, or a Fiero. You could do a Fiero.
I mean, you could.
MR2.
That's better.
But yeah, so those are going to make it a lot easier. You still have to worry about kind of closing off that very back where the exhaust is, but it's a lot easier to manage there. But for most of us that are working with kind of front engine, rear wheel drive, front engine, front wheel drive, this is going to be something you have to worry about. So running that exhaust is going to out the side is going to be very beneficial. And I mean, ideally you can just run it straight out the hood, but unfortunately most racing organizations have to make you have it exit behind the main roll hoop. But I feel like they should let it. Yeah, I mean, there's so many benefits.
For life, you know.
so many benefits of running out the hood. Then it's loud. I mean, everyone loves it being loud.
Yeah.
It lower back pressure, and it looks cool, and
You
an
can
added
see your own fireballs.
Exactly. You can see your fireballs, and then also you can see like oil or coolant coming out of it if you have a failing engine. It's a good
It's a safety
troubleshooting device. Yeah. So, but unfortunately, I think outside of drag racing, I don't really see that being possible. So, at least rules wise. So yeah, I mean, running it down the side is going to really benefit you there when making a flat bottom. So then, so yeah, you just gonna want to make sure you make it as flat and smooth as possible. No kind of weird transitions or anything, because that's going to help keep that air attached all the way through the bottom of the car, and also keep that boundary layer from building up too much and basically stalling out that kind of underbody that you're trying to get a lot of good airflow through. So, so from there, you're going to head up to the back. So rear diffusers, a lot of times you can see them on lots of different cars. Nowadays, you look at the back of like a Ford Mustang, and they have sweet looking little mini diffusers and stuff on it. And they look good, but they're not exactly effective, I guess. A lot of people just think that if something's on a car, like if one of these big companies, they have a designer doing something, it's for a good reason, but there's a lot of reasons for things, and styling is something that can trump a lot of different aspects of a car. So a lot of times it's more to look good. Maybe
you get those design studio people making these I don't know, just going their own way, making things look good and giving you some fake news advice. So gotta watch out.
Yeah, having it's all a balance. So a lot of times those kind of rear diffusers that you see, they're a lot for looks. Maybe they can get a count or two in drag reduction, because that's the other most OEM aerodynamics, kind of aerodynamic development goes into drag reduction. Occasionally they'll foray into a little bit of downforce stuff for your really high performance cars, but nothing kind of too crazy. So, but basically having a similar approach to your race car, just kind of slapping a diffuser on the back without having a flat bottom feeding it, is kind of a potentially not very effective kind of pursuit, because that diffuser, if it's not getting nice, clean, fast flowing air, it's not really going to do too much other than potentially slightly reduce kind of the separation or kind of pressure buildup that you get in the rear of the car, kind of like behind the rear bumper. So if you're able to kind of smooth out the rear, it can help the air flow at least from the bottom of the car out, but for the most part, it's not really going to be, maybe it's just a small drag improvement. It's not going to be much of a downforce improvement. So if you're going to add a diffuser, definitely you're going to want a flat bottom. But with that said, as far as the diffuser itself, kind of as we were talking about earlier, the one thing we see done kind of wrong is people trying to make as huge of a diffuser as possible. They have it going up at like a 30-degree angle, and it looks sweet, and it's got to be working. It looks good. It's huge. I mean, real race cars have big diffusers, but that's actually not necessarily the case. I mean, if you look at a Formula One car now, they're very rules limited, and everything they do is very much to work within those rules. But I mean, you look at their diffuser, and it's tiny comparatively. So, but they're creating so much downforce with it. So it's not really about the angle. Now, like we said, you can find some papers online. Keeping it kind of around that 10 to 13 degree range should be sustainable as far as a kind of a separation point of view. So that's one area to start, and then you can also add a few kind of veins in the center of that to help keep it attached. But that can add a little bit of drag, but it's not going to be a huge effect. And then another thing I've seen actually with those veins is basically they'll space the veins a lot closer on the outer edge of the diffuser, and that's kind of almost trying to isolate the dirty air coming off the rear wheels and trying to prevent that from kind of messing with the rest of the diffuser. So by kind of almost sacrificing your outer kind of channels of your diffuser, you then can maybe improve kind of the flow through the middle of the diffuser by trying to keep those separated off. So that's one thing I've seen on some time attack cars. But
I mean, I've seen that on real race cars too.
Yes.
Not that time attack cars aren't, I guess, but manufacturer made race cars, I guess.
Yeah, like GT3 and GTD or GTE.
Yep.
So yeah, it's something you'll see. So I imagine they're doing it for a reason. I haven't seen, the actual CFD results or anything of that, but that's my understanding of what they're doing there. But speaking of time attack cars, a lot of the times the reason why you see such giant diffusers on those is because they are trying to start that diffuser basically as further forward of the car as possible. So as I was trying to explain with kind of the peak pressure, or the peak air velocity of the diffuser will be at the very beginning of that, kind of before it starts expanding. So that'll be your lowest pressure. So at basically at when we're talking underbody aero, lowering the pressure at the bottom relatively increases the pressure on the top, which is going to give you downforce. So think of it as sucking the car to the ground, right? Yes. And by moving that point forward, that kind of initial expansion point of the diffuser forward, you're then moving the center of pressure of your underbody forward. So that can help out in a lot of ways. If you are front downforce limited, maybe your splitter kind of can't be, by regulation, can't be really large, and you can't fit really large kind of splitter diffusers in, and short of adding a giant front wing off the hood or something, you can't really get too much more front downforce. Having that diffuser start kind of towards the center of the car can really help that. And then also it really helps keep that center of pressure from changing as you go up in speed. So basically it makes for a more stable car. So since having a really extreme diffuser angle can create a lot of separation issues and basically ruin the efficiency of that diffuser, by starting it earlier, you can then have it expand overall much larger by keeping it at that relatively low angle, but then expanding it as you go along the car. So that's why you'll see, that's how those time attack cars can get away with such huge splitter or diffusers, because
right, it's not necessarily a more aggressive angle, it's just starting sooner.
Yes.
So but it ends being larger just because of that extra distance.
Yeah, and starting it that early though is, there's a reason why those guys have to chop up those cars so much, is because basically in order to do that, you're cutting into probably potentially the unibody of the car. You're going to be running your rear suspension through those tunnels, and maybe your drive shafts and everything. So those are going to slightly affect the efficiency of the diffuser, but having that larger diffuser overall is going to benefit them. But it's definitely very challenging to run a diffuser like that. A lot of times, you got to cut your entire trunk out, and maybe even like the rear seat area of your car, you're modifying that. So it's definitely way more in the advanced side as far as aero. So just doing but for just amateur level kind of wheel-to-wheel racing, champ car, WRAR, that kind of stuff, I think a lot of cars could see a pretty good benefit from going with a flat bottom into a diffuser that starts right around the rear diff, and then kind of expanding it out at that maybe 10 to 13 degrees, and then adding some vanes if needed. If you and you can throw a GoPro under there and add some wool tufts and see how, if the air is staying attached to the top of that diffuser, then you know that the angle isn't too extreme. You could try kind of flow vis paint. I've seen online some cheap ways to kind of make that.
Yeah, that might be a decent way to, I guess, not affect what you're watching, right? Because throwing a GoPro under there will undoubtedly affect your flow, right?
Yeah. So yeah, it doesn't intrude on kind of how everything's working there by using some flow vis paint, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can try to practically do it. But I mean, ultimately you can just throw a driver that knows the car well and knows how to handle it well, and kind of get their feedback on it too. That can always be useful. So, but I guess one more thing to look out for with the underbody, and especially with a diffuser as well, like we were saying with underbody cooling, getting that exhaust out of there, but even that might not be enough in a lot of cases. So you still have parts like, if it's rear wheel drive, you have your drive shaft, your rear diff, transmission. All of those rely on some cooling from airflow underneath the car in order to keep the oil temperature down, in order to maybe prevent like things like seals or other things from getting too hot.
Sure. I mean, if you look at the fins on a E30, I think probably a lot of our audience has seen an E30. The fins on the diff, they get pretty wild. They're very intricate.
Yeah.
Or large anyway. And that's to cool the diff. Like, you need airflow over that for those to work.
Yeah. So that's where you're going to want to start. Ideally, you can have some oil temperature sensors in your transmission and diff and be able to monitor that. And you can mess with basically adding ducting, whether you can potentially duct from the top of the car or like the windows. You could basically make ducts that go through the kind of rear trunk area into the diff area. You can add some NACA ducts to the diff, to kind of the flat bottom itself, in order to pull air up into those parts. And if you use something like a NACA duct, which basically it's a profile designed to kind of pull air from a flat surface relatively efficiently. You can find them. You can buy them basically anywhere.
You can buy molded ones, or you can find profiles online to make them. It's pretty easy.
Yeah, so they're going to be your kind of most efficient way to duct from that underbody. But of course, as we said, that will affect the efficiency of it. But ultimately, if your car can't go more than 10 laps without overheating the transmission or something, then it's not going to be anywhere near as fast as a car that that can be reliable. So
yeah, you got to finish, right?
Yes. So that's one place. We on our Lemons Volvo, we messed with some flat bottom stuff, and yeah, we found we had some issues with heat damage stuff when running that flat bottom. I think we had a fuel pump fail, so that's just it's underneath the car, kind of in the open, and it relied on some air cooling, and by having not only that, but funneling basically some hot exhaust heat towards it also didn't help. So we had some issues there, and ultimately we found that we couldn't make a nice and efficient enough flat bottom to warrant really having it. Once we took it off, we didn't really see much difference in lap time, other than the added. We saw some benefit from basically taking almost 30 pounds off the car in parts, and then ultimately when we race in a champ car, then we don't have to use those points towards that. So really, in that case, it didn't seem really worth it. So it's definitely, the flat bottom and diffuser can be where you can find a lot of gains in both drag as well as downforce, but it can be kind of the hardest area to execute because, I mean, also you got to think about when you have to say you have to change a clutch or a transmission or you have a failure during a race. Now you need to remove that entire flat bottom assembly. So, yeah, you can come up with some smart ways to make it easily removable, but that's gonna take some time and development. You're gonna have to create like a kind of mounting structure under the car to fit it properly, and so it could be a lot of a difficulty to implement it versus maybe if it's not designed right, it won't be too much of a reward. So it's definitely the last place to look, and it's where you can gain a lot, but you just have to be very mindful that it's done right and you're not creating any reliability concerns or kind of working on the car concerns. So, but yeah, I mean, from there, that's where I think that's where your amateur level aero kind of ends. That's where my kind of knowledge starts to get a little thinner, but I mean, just using those ideas can get you pretty good gains on the track. I mean, from there you can, that's where, from there you're gonna want to hire someone who knows some CFDing and maybe rent out a wind tunnel too to test different things. From there, I think you're starting to get out of your kind of budget racing series, and you're getting more into professional or full on very high dollar, high funded kind of situations. So
Right. Yeah, I think if you manage to keep the core concepts in your head, then everything else just sort of lines up without going too crazy, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not trying to capture or control the weight coming off of tires, right? You just, Bernoulli's principle, one side's high speed, one side's low speed, creating the pressure differential. As long as you keep that in mind, I think things should be relatively easy, at least to think about, right? One thing we didn't mention, and, we don't need to go over it probably, but, if someone's makes some hood vents, what's going to happen there? Well, what's the temperature of the air that's coming out? What does that mean for the density? So then you can sort of extrapolate what's going to happen with your pressure and everything from there. So just don't forget your core concepts, and that'll help you out the most.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of kind of monkey see, monkey do with a lot of aero stuff. So just be careful. Don't just copy without really knowing the idea behind it. I
was just gonna say, I've seen some people put aero devices on the car that either didn't work, but other teams didn't know that, so they copied it. Or they put something on the car that they either thought looked cool or they were trying to trick somebody, and other teams still copy it. So, race your own race, play your own game sort of thing. Know what you're doing. Don't just copy what you see. Unless you're going for looks, if that's what you care about, then do whatever you want. But
yeah, I guess you brought up you bring up hood vents makes me want to quickly kind of go through a couple kind of little things I see people do wrong to kind of close out this segment. But so areas I can see people have kind of low hanging fruit is something like with a hood vent. You want to make sure you're starting that hood vent as close to the front of the hood as possible and towards the radiator, as that's going to be kind of your lowest pressure area of the hood. As you get closer to the windshield, the pressure kind of builds as you get it kind of stagnates at the base of the windshield. So a lot of times, like, people will see people add some venting there, like you'll see those like cowl hoods for drag cars. There's a reason why drag cars use those, and that's to get air funneled into the intake. So basically, they're pulling air from that base of the windshield into where they have their carburetor or whatever, and their big air cleaner. And they're also obviously they're creating some clearance for their giant,
Supercharger.
mega carb and supercharger, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But they can also use it as a kind of an intake benefit, as an inlet. Of course, when you're trying to make hood venting ducts for your cooling system, that's going to be
It's the opposite direction.
That's the opposite direction. So you want them as far kind of towards the front of the hood as possible, and the further kind of outward you can put them can also help a little bit there too. But yeah, but you can find some small downforce benefits from venting that kind of high pressure dirty air from the engine bay. Basically, by venting it out the hood, you're preventing it from venting out kind of the wheel well area or the underbody, which can help kind of improve overall efficiency. So, but
Right. And not to mention that helps your cooling, right? You're extracting, if you place it right, you're extracting that, well, hopefully not like completely stagnating, but that air that's right behind the radiator, you're giving it a place to go, so to speak.
yeah.
So, if you're having cooling problems, maybe, it's not just a downforce device, but
Yeah.
just a good one all around.
Yeah, and one thing the most efficient way to kind of duct that radiator air is to have a kind of closed system where you're have a duct that seals to the front of the radiator, seals to the rear, and then vents straight out the hood. That's your best case scenario. But a lot of times it's kind of hard to fit that in most cars, because right behind the radiator is the whole fan assembly, and then the engine's basically almost touching that. So in order to do that, a lot of times you have to kind of reposition, maybe lean forward that radiator. One thing to look out for there is if you lower your radiator, and if it's the type that either has the cap on it or is meant to be the highest point in the cooling system, that can create some problems. But maybe we could go over that in another episode, kind of cooling system stuff. But then also, like, a lot of the airflow into the engine bay that's used to cool it is actually coming through the radiator opening. So that's one area to look out for. Maybe you might need some slight additional venting, but also the benefit of ducting your radiator out is the hot rear radiator air that's coming out is not going to go right into the engine bay. So there's a lot of things to look out for there, but that's kind of your optimal setup if you can fit it. But just adding some vents can help your downforce, potentially your front downforce, a little bit, maybe drag a tiny bit, and then you're cooling. So, but yeah, keep them away from the base of the windshield. That'll be potentially you're just making kind of
right. The
air
base of the
inlets.
windshield is a high pressure area, right? So
Yeah.
you can't really vent to a high pressure, and we'll try and push the opposite direction.
Yeah, so that's not good. And then I guess another area that I see a lot of people kind of, especially in like say Champ Car, where you're not allowed to run glass. Basically, a lot of teams will just remove all of the glass from the car and then not replace it with anything. Of course, you can keep your glass windshield, but the side windows, which are required to be open. But then you have your kind of rear quarter windows, or if it's a 4-door, your rear door windows, and then your back window. Kind of not having windows there is going to be a huge drag penalty. You're going to have a lot of air recirculation coming off the top of the car, and really messing with that air that you want working with your rear wing. And then also I've seen it even in certain types of cars, like kind of hatchbacks. It can be dangerous if there's a fire out the back of the car. A lot of times it can recirculate back into the car if you don't have a rear window. So
Sure. Yeah, I think, and maybe correct me if this analogy is wrong, but I think a lot of people think of it as, oh, well, if I replace those parts, I'm just throwing air into my car, and they think of a parachute.
Yeah.
Whereas it's more of you have X volume of air in your car, and it does circulate somewhat, but you're not continuously, I guess, refilling it with the air that you're driving through. It's better, though incorrect, it's probably better to think of it as stagnant. And then by sealing the windows behind you, that gives you that benefit of keeping the air stagnant, where if it's open, it's moving. And, like you said, you're keeping that flow more attached to the car, and that's how you keep your aerodynamic devices working.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one area where I think you can see quite a big benefit from really not too much work, a little extra weight, but I think overall pretty big aero benefit. So I think that's one. I think two areas, that the hood vents and the windows is one area, two areas where I see maybe kind of low hanging fruit that people are not either maybe not doing right or could just improve relatively easily. So,
you know what I'm a little surprised I haven't seen more of in this crap can racing, as long as we're still just adding in little bits and pieces here. Those sick vortex generators you might see on someone's Evo.
Oh yeah, vortex generators. I mean, they can be. There's people can do studies and they can find they work. Mainly, it's trying to keep maybe air coming off, like specifically the Evo. I think the actual Mitsubishi rally cars had those parts, but it was trying to keep the air attached as it kind of comes over that really steep rear window to then affect that wing that I'm sure there was homologated to have a certain size or something. So, I mean, I think they can work, but I don't think they work the way as much as, I guess, as effectively as people think. But yeah, I am surprised I don't see those like all over people's cars.
Yeah,
but they do look cool. They
look cool. And if you need more advertisement to put it on your crap can race car, they're on airplanes.
Oh, that's right. They are on airplanes.
Like big bombers and stuff. So there you go. Real world use. It's good enough for you.
Yeah. So exactly. Just keep sticking things on your car, and I mean, if it looks cool, it looks cool. I mean, if you want it to perform well, that's another story. But yeah, I mean, there's other ways you can keep airflow attached, or just maybe put your wing in a spot where you don't need those, that kind of thing. So, just because you see a certain race car do something doesn't mean it's going to be best for you. So, yeah, as we said, so just a couple things to look out for. But yeah, I think that basically covers us for Intro to Aero Part 2 Amateur Racing Edition. I mean, I think maybe in the future we could do kind of a little more research on some of those more kind of complex parts you see on kind of prototype and formula cars. But I think that, like we said, that kind of implementing those can be much more difficult. But that's something we could go into if there's some interest there.
Yeah. And some of it is, I think we should go into it. I mean, intros to these different concepts are good. And then we'll just make sure that everybody's on the same page before we get too technical, right? But I do want to get pretty technical, because that's the cool part. I mean, we're engineers, right? We're not, that's where I want to go. So But I think this is a good place to start, so we're all sort of on this baseline. And when we start talking about these more technical things, it's really just in the pursuit of why and knowledge, because it's neat.
Yeah.
One Formula front wing assembly is 2 years worth of full-time employee work, right? So
Yeah.
what is it? If you work 40 hours a week, 50 working weeks in a year, that's 2,000 hours, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they take 4,000 hours to make.
Yeah.
You're probably not
And
going to do that in your garage. So we're not
Yeah.
trying to get anybody to make this stuff. It's just cool to explore why and how they work.
Exactly. Yeah, we're not saying like that many to manufacture. That's design, analysis, iteration after iteration, and then finally some very high skilled technician lays it up. And yes, it's for them to get to that level. These are full time employees working. So in order to get that wing out in a 3-month off season or whatever, they're going to have 10, 15 guys working on the whole thing. And so, yeah, that's where we don't really have the expertise, but we can do our best to, I think sometimes it helps to explain it from a level of kind of someone who maybe isn't an expert of it, trying to kind of explain it as best they can to maybe someone who doesn't have experience with it. So it's what we love the tech. We love the designs that go that these race teams come up with. So we'd like to go through those as much as we can. But all the stuff we've gone through in these first 2 Aero episodes, really, if you look at any GT3 car, that's mostly what they're using. They're using splitters, flat bottoms, diffusers, rear wings, and that's about it. But they're hitting sustained 2Gs in the corners. Their lap times are very, very quick. So you can get quite far with just those and optimizing those. So this will get you started, and then if we in the future we can go through some more complex stuff. But yeah, that basically finishes off this one. I think I guess a little sneak peek. One thing we were thinking of doing is specifically for our Champ Car audience, we were thinking of doing kind of a road to the championship series where we kind of go through the contenders and maybe even have some teams on to interview them and see what their plans are, their strategies, if they what are they doing to maybe be able to get that win. So that's one thing we're talking about doing. And then of course continuing with our other kind of tech talks, just like aero tires, that kind of thing. And then of course covering the Daytona 24 and any other racing coming up here. So yeah, stay tuned. Thanks again for listening with us, and if you have any questions or requests or corrections or anything, feel free to reach out to us on our Facebook, which is Motorsports Tech Talk, or our Instagram at Motorsports Tech Talk. Both of those we're trying to post on more. We put all the episodes up there. The Instagram we're trying to post up more and more, just little tidbits here and there.
Yep.
So feel free to give us a
facts.
follow. Yeah, give us a follow. Give us a subscribe on we have a YouTube as well. We put these episodes up there too to make them accessible to more people. So yeah, just feel free to follow, subscribe, rate, whatever. Hit the like button. That's a thing, right?
Is it?
So
yeah, do that.
So yeah, thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.